I call the member for Blaxland.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Malcolm Turnbull has had one job for the last 2.5 years, and that's to build the NBN. And he has made a mess of it. Any objective analysis is he's made a mess of it. Almost everything he has promised he would do on the NBN, he has failed to deliver. And now, almost every week, we have more evidence of the mess that he has made with the building of his second-rate NBN. I give you just 3 examples. The first and the worst is the massive blowout in cost. Malcolm Turnbull said before the last election that he could build a slower second-rate NBN for $29.5 billion. Well, we now know that that's blown out to how much? As much as $56 billion. It's blown out by almost 100%. And this is a man who says, I've got business experience, I used to be a merchant banker, I've got the skills to do the job. He's blown the budget on the NBN by almost 100%. If this was anybody else, they would have got the sack. But not this man. He was promoted. Now, the second example of the failure and the mess on the NBN is time. The massive blowout in the time it's going to take to build the NBN. Malcolm Turnbull promised before the last election that everyone would have access to the NBN this year, 2016. Well, that's now not going to happen. How many people do you think will get the NBN this year? It's not 100%, it's not 50%, 40, 30, 20. As we stand here today, less than 15% of the country has access to the NBN. Another massive broken promise, another massive fail by this Prime Minister who deceived the people of Australia at the last election by promising that everyone would get access to the NBN this year. And if you're listening to this or watching this and you're still buffering, then blame the Prime Minister, because he promised you would have access to the NBN this year. In fact, the former Prime Minister went one step further. He issued an open letter to the people of Australia on election night, and he said this: I want our NBN rolled out within 3 years, and Malcolm Turnbull is the right person to make this happen. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, it seems the former Prime Minister was wrong to trust Malcolm Turnbull on this and a lot of other things. Now, I'm indebted to the member for Franklin because she's also brought to my attention another document which is even bolder, which is even more brazen. It's called the Coalition's Economic Growth Plan for Tasmania. And this doesn't promise that everyone would get access to the NBN by 2016. This says at page 23, National Broadband Network, the rollout of the NBN under the Coalition will be complete in Tasmania by the end of 2015. By the end of 2015. Well, last time I checked the calendar, it's 2016, and guess what? It hasn't been built in Tasmania. In fact, not one person in Tasmania has been switched on to their second-rate copper NBN yet. The people of Tasmania, Deputy Speaker, just like the people of Australia right across the country, have been duped by this Prime Minister and this deceitful government. Now, the third example is copper and the massive blowout in the cost of fixing the copper. Late last year, I told the parliament that we'd found out in estimates that the government was buying 2,000 kilometres, 2 million metres of new copper to build their second-rate NBN, enough copper to link Australia to New Zealand. But what we find out now, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that's the tip of the iceberg. It's not 2 million metres. We now find out that, from a question on notice, they're planning to buy 8.5 million metres of copper. Now, just to put that in perspective, that's enough copper to connect Brisbane to Beijing, or Perth to Pakistan, or Kalgoorlie to Kuala Lumpur and back. That's how much new copper they have to buy to make this second-rate network work. But that's not the worst of it, because through a leaked document that was revealed in the press late last year, it's also now been revealed that the cost of fixing the second-rate copper network has blown out by over 1,000%. Now, 1,000%. Now, when the strategic review came out in December of 2013, I was scolded by the now Prime Minister for saying he hadn't properly allowed enough money to fix the copper. He said in this House opposite me, he said, the critics of the Coalition's approach to broadband have claimed that the Coalition has not paid enough attention to the need for remediation of the existing copper plan. As honourable members will see when studying this report, that matter has been taken most carefully into account, and very conservative assumptions have been taken.
You said it more pompously than that, though.
That's true. Deputy Speaker, he didn't tell us then what those conservative assumptions were, but thanks to this leaked document, we know that then, when they released the strategic review, they assumed that it would cost $55 million to fix Telstra's old copper network to make their second-rate NBN work. What we also know from this document is it's not going to cost $55 million. It's now going to cost $641 million. In other words, a blowout of more than 1,000%. By any objective analysis, this is a massive mess, and the Prime Minister has no one else to blame for this but himself. And now, in estimates, last night it's been revealed that there are even more problems, because in the first places where they are now switching on their second-rate copper NBN, guess what? It's not working. It's not working properly. Instead of getting faster broadband that they were promised, they're now getting slower broadband services than they were getting with ADSL. Here's just a couple of examples. Max Taylor from Gorican recently switched over from ADSL to fibre to the node. He used to get 8 megabits per second. Now he's getting as low as 3 megabits per second, slower than his old ADSL. Here's another one. Lawrence Alderton from Belmont. He says, and I quote, "I've been connected to the NBN for 2 days with TPG 25 megabits plan. What a joke. Peak times, download speeds of around 4 megabits. That's less than my old ADSL too." Here's another one. Jan Rieger, whose elderly parents live in Bundaberg. They've now gone from 12 megabits per second with ADSL down to as low as 2 megabits per second, and as a result, these elderly people can no longer Skype their children and their grandchildren in the UAE and Korea. And we've got lots more stories like this. They are flooding into affected electorate offices, both Labor and Coalition. It is a right royal stuffer, and more evidence of the mess that this Prime Minister has made of the NBN. He promised people faster broadband speed. In fact, they're getting the reverse. And the boss of the NBN last night in estimates admitted, and I'm quoting him here, "I am certain these problems are real." Now, in a minute we're going to hear from the government and they're going to crow about what a fabulous job they've done on the NBN. Well, my response to that is fix this mess, fix this problem. So this is where we are. The cost of the second-rate NBN has doubled. The time it will take to build this second-rate NBN has more than doubled. The cost of fibre to the node, by the way, has tripled, up from $600 to $1,600. The cost of fixing the copper has blown out by more than 1,000%. And in the places where they are starting to roll this mess out, it's not working properly. This, Mr Speaker, let me be very, very clear. This mess is going to haunt this Prime Minister. It is evidence of his failure to deliver and evidence that he can't be trusted, evidence that he says one thing before an election and then does another. And in the longer term, it will be evidence of his bad judgment, his lack of vision, and that he just simply got this wrong. And let me give you one more example to prove it. Before the last election, in his election policy, the Prime Minister said, "I've got an example from America to show why fibre to the node is better than fibre to the premises." He gave the example of Verizon and AT&T. Verizon built fibre to the premises, AT&T went and built fibre to the node. And he said AT&T made the right decision because it was cheaper and they were making the same amount of money. Well, guess what AT&T announced in December last year? They're rolling out fibre to the premises for 14 million homes across the country. And in places where they rolled out fibre to the node, they're going back and building fibre to the premises. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, that's what's going to happen here in Australia, and it's going to take a Labor government to do it. to come back and finish off the NBN and fix Malcolm Turnbull's mess.
Order, and I call the Minister for Territories, Local Government and Major Projects.
The Shadow Minister is in a more desperate position week by week as the rollout inexorably continues and gathers pace, and here he is trying to pretend it's not succeeding. He's like the Black Knight of Parliament, saying only a flesh wound as the NBN homes passed reach 1.7 million, many multiples of what Labor ever achieved. As the NBN premises pass rate passes 10,000 a week, as the fibre to the node rollout reaches 123,000 in December of last year, as NBN revenue for the year ended, or the 6 months ended 31 December 2015, reaches 164 million, more than double revenue in the previous corresponding period, as HFC trials are being conducted in multiple states, as the fixed wireless network reaches 1,265 base stations, as NBN successfully launches its first satellite, as wireless premises covered reach 342,000, as NBN is on track to meet 500,000 fibre-to-the-node premises by the 30th of June this year and adding 8,000 premises a week, as the NBN Net Promoter Score, that is what its customers assess it at, is at plus 31, an extraordinarily positive result, and yet here is the same tired refrain from the Shadow Minister, the same tired refrain, oh, it's a failure. He is like the Black Knight of the Parliament, only a flesh wound as another limb gets lopped off, but the facts are inexorably mounting up. We know that there are connections to over 600,000 premises currently under construction, and design work is underway for a further 1.3 million premises. We know that the NBN is on track to expand its footprint by 15,000 premises per week, rising to 25,000 per week by mid-year. Now, how does this compare with what Labor was delivering in its underwhelming, distinctly underwhelming tenure during its time in government, when it sought to roll out a broadband network and failed miserably? We know that when Labor left office after more than 4 years, only some 300,000 premises, barely 300,000 premises, could be connected to the NBN after 4.5 years. And yet, in a bit over 2 years, 2.5 years, we are at 1.7 million and the rate rising inexorably every week. And yet, in the face of these undeniable facts, the Shadow Minister clings to his self-deluded belief that Labor could do better, ignorant, completely denying the dismal reality of what Labor actually did when it was in power. Let's have a look at some of the advantages of fibre to the node, which the Shadow Minister has been so critical of. The cost of rolling out this technology is markedly lower than fibre to the premises. It's in line with the corporate plan expectations at around $2,300 per premises, around half the $4,419 per premise that fibre to the premises would cost. And very significantly, despite the breathless rhetoric from the Shadow Minister, the reality is that customers are just as comfortable with fibre to the node as they are with fibre to the premises. We had a couple of anecdotes from the Shadow Minister, but where's the data? Where's the data? He ignored the data, even though the data has been published by the NBN, because both fibre to the node and fibre to the premises customers report a satisfaction score of 7.7 out of 10. So when you compare the satisfaction of fibre to the node and fibre to the premises customers, you see the same satisfaction rating of 7.7. And now the Shadow Minister says, the Shadow Minister seems incredulous that the CEO of NBN, when presented with instances of customers with concerns, would say, I'm certain those problems are real. But let's be clear, one of the overwhelming differences between the Coalition's approach to the NBN and Labor's approach to the NBN is that the Coalition has always been frank about the difficulties and challenges of rolling out this network. after Labor engaged in 6 years of treating the NBN as a generator of photo opportunities, when Labor treated the NBN as a provider of political services rather than of broadband services, what you saw under the then Minister for Communications, now Prime Minister, was an insistence on transparency and openness with the Australian people. Under the current Prime Minister, when he became Communications Minister, he insisted that NBN every week report on its website actual numbers of premises passed, the detail there on how the rollout was actually performing, because this was all part of turning around the company from the dismal performance that we saw under Labor, the complete lack of operational competence, and getting the company going on track towards systematically increasing the numbers of premises being connected each week. And are there instances where customers are not getting the service they should be? Of course there are. In a network of this scale, of course there are. And is a Chief Executive Officer going to acknowledge those problems? Of course he will, because the whole approach with the NBN under the coalition has been to frankly admit that this is an extremely ambitious project, to focus on openness and on transparency, to get capable people onto the board and capable people onto the executive, globally qualified executives like Bill Morrow leading the company, so that we can steadily, sustainably, consistently improve the operational performance of NBN and get the rollout going where it needs to go. Let's just remember the chaotic mess that we had under Labor, starting with a sweeping but ill-conceived promise from Messrs Rudd, Conroy, Tanner and Swan in April 2009 that it was going to be a 100 megabit per second network and it was going to cost $43 billion. It was going to be such a great investment. Then Prime Minister Rudd said in April 2009 that mums and dads should invest in the bonds issued to fund NBN. If there has been a more negligent piece of financial advice given by a Prime Minister in Australian history, I will be very surprised. We were told at the time that there was going to be substantial private sector investment. Remember that claim from Labor. Of course, about a year later, what happened was that the implementation study conducted by KPMG and McKinsey was slipped out in the dead of night, the Sunday before budget in 2010, and guess what it said? It said the private sector wouldn't touch it with a barge pole because it was such an ill-conceived project, so all the money had to come from taxpayers. That is Labor's approach to financial management, and that's the mess we have been charged with cleaning up, and the Prime Minister, in his capacity as Communications Minister, did a truly remarkable job in turning around what was a mess. We had absolutely incompetent execution from Labor. After 4.5 years, they'd reached a mere slightly over 300,000 premises. But what is their suggestion now, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker? This is perhaps the most troubling issue of all. What is it that the Shadow Minister is seriously suggesting to the Australian people should happen if Labor returns to power? He is claiming that if Labor returns to power, the NBN will return to a fibre-to-the-premises approach. How has this suggestion been received, not by political activists, but by industry participants? What did the Chief Executive of M2, one of the major telcos in Australia, have to say about this suggestion from the Shadow Minister? Quotes, "I think any further change in deployment model would be ill-advised. I wouldn't advocate for any change." That's what the industry said, not politicians. What did the Australian Financial Review say about this brilliant idea? The Australian Financial Review said, quote, "Labor has no credibility in this area. The NBN, as conceived under Rudd Labor, turned an important piece of national infrastructure running to a sensible timetable into a Kevin Rudd vanity project with no real idea of the costs that ran to a political schedule. It went from $4.7 billion in 2007 to $42 billion in 2009 to cost at least $56 billion today." The facts are clear, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The facts are clear. The coalition government in 2013 inherited a chaotically mismanaged mess from Labor. As The current Prime Minister, in his time as Communications Minister, did an extraordinary job turning the company around. There's still a big job ahead, but we are well on track with 1.7 million premises and climbing steadily.
Order, and I call the honourable member for Perth.
Mr Deputy Speaker, look, this is a really important debate because the NBN is critical to our future. We are operating in a global environment, and if our telecommunications are not of world standard, we will not be able to compete, and that is particularly critical in Western Australia. We see that with the mining sector mining boom winding down, unemployment ratcheting up, that we need to have a diversification within our economy. We need to move to 21st century jobs, and we need the digital infrastructure that underpins that. But despite the endless rhetoric that we get from the Prime Minister about technological innovation and agility, we are failing the future with our substandard attempt at a national broadband network. Now, my electorate of Perth is pretty much a microcosm of how this government has not only trashed the real NBN, but failed in its own second-rate version. Now, when the Prime Minister announced broadband, its one saving grace was supposed to be that relying on the degraded copper network and delivering only 20th century speeds, it might have been an inferior product, but we're all going to get it a lot quicker. We're all going to get it by the end of 2016. So sooner was one of the taglines for the Coalition's fraud ban. Now let's see how that's played out in Perth. Now I want to talk first of all about the Bassendean exchange. Suburbs Ashfield, Bassendean, Beechborough, Eden Hill, Kiara, Lockridge, Morley. They're all on the schedule when the Labor lost government in 2013, and they were set to receive fibre to the premises by 2014. And the preliminary work had all been done. We'd upgraded. We'd spent $2 million upgrading the Telstra exchange, so it was all ready. Yet we noticed in 2014, when the first rollout plan came from this government, something was missing. None of those suburbs had been included on the rollout. Now, we then campaigned very strongly about this, and lo and behold, the next year they were put back onto the rollout. But now they're going to, the very earliest that they will be seeing this start is the end of 2016. That will be the start of construction, and we know how lousy the copper infrastructure is in those suburbs. We know how the voice calls drop out when it rains, so we know that the likelihood of this being in place even by 2017 is very unlikely. So it's later, slower and more expensive. Now, we go to our next set of suburbs, even closer to the CBD, those that operate out of the Maylands Exchange: Bedford, Maylands, Embleton, Inglewood, Naranda and Dianella. NBN isn't even a distant light on the horizon. Now, despite sitting on the lowest band for broadband quality in the nation, these suburbs aren't on the 3-year rollout. Now, I'll let the residents tell you about the situation in their own words. First of all, Sheila Pretzel from Bayswater, she says, the section of Bayswater where I live does not have internet access, period. This means that residents must use Wi-Fi dongles and the reception is hit and miss. It means no Netflix, no updating of Blu-ray software, no ability to use the smart system link to MyAir, etc. It's like living in the 1980s. This is Maylands, the land of the mullet. Betty Wong from Bedford tells us, though the exchange is diagonally 100 metres across from our house, we are unable to access iiNet, Naked or ADSL2+. Bayswater resident Scott Overhue says, people don't believe me when I tell them that a YouTube video still buffers at the lowest definition they have. Unfortunately, I live in Bayswater, and with 9 new residents in my street with infill, it just gets slower and slower. And Anne Blake from Dianella, She says, looking at the maps of the rollout in the eastern states, I sometimes wonder if Western Australia is treated as an afterthought. Sadly, when the rollout is completed, we will still have a second-class system, which no doubt will feel the strain of more and more demands being placed on it. This isn't a niche issue. Our campaign over the past 2 years has proved one thing. Nothing arouses the passions in the electorate more than missing out on the 21st century technology we need for our future. And just this morning, a Highgate resident, Steve Ebsery, emailed me with his thoughts on the internet, on the NBN.
Order. Members' time is expired. Call the honourable member for Wannon.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and I might say nothing arouses passion in the electorate like utter nonsense, and that is what we've been hearing from the other side. And people in regional and rural Australia know this more than anyone else, because under the Labor Party and their rollout of the NBN, we were neglected, like we were neglected when it comes to the rollout of mobile phone towers. 6 years of Labor. 6 years, what did we get from them? What did we get from them? A big fat zero. A big fat zero. And what were we going to get from them when it came to the NBN? We were going to get a system which was rolled out into regional and rural Australia last. And we were going to get it. We were going to get it in 2025, 2026. And I'm happy to use my electorate as an example, but let's go to what the Shadow Minister had to say to start with. He talked about a blowout in cost. Well, what has happened to his memory? He has the audaciousness to get up and talk about a blowout in cost. The audacity to get up, thank you, the audacity to get up and talk about a blowout in cost. What happened under Labor? Huge blowout in cost. And not only that, what if we go back to Labor's regime? Labor's regime. We're talking $74 to $84 billion and completion in 2026. How can you get up here with a straight face and say this? We're talking about time. Time. Under Labor. NBN Co failed to meet every rollout target. Every rollout target you failed to meet. Every single one. Every single one. And
Member for Chifley. The member for Chifley.
Even your minister, who is now just a senator in the upper house, says we clearly underestimated, and I think it's fair to say, the construction model could be legitimately criticised. That's Senator Stephen Conroy. We wouldn't have been so aggressive if we'd known how tough it was for the company. So that was an area where we were overly ambitious. I can understand and indeed empathise with those who are disappointed with the progress of the fibre rollout. That's not us. That's your side. That's your side. And having heard all this, what are the Labor Party going to do? They are going to go back to their broken model. So they can't learn. It's like every other area. 6 years of failure and they want to go back to it. 6 years of failure and they want to go back to it. Well, the Australian people will not be fooled, and people in regional and rural Australia will not be fooled, because for my electorate, Mr Deputy Speaker, for my electorate, what we are going to see is a completely different story. In very welcome news, NBN construction will be occurring right across Wannon by the end of 2017. That is exceptionally good news. Now, if we still had a Labor government, do you know what year I would be mentioning? 2026. I've been old man. 2026. And not only that, 2026, and we still wouldn't have any additional mobile phone towers. Well, it does. And I think I think it was probably the beer coaster. Taking that plan and getting it mapped properly was probably one of the key reasons, but there's probably a number of others, Mr Deputy Speaker. But in Wannon, by the end of 2017, we will have construction having started right across the electorate. That is very good news for my constituents. That's the type of news that gets them passionate about government and about what government can deliver, because, as we all know, we need to make sure that in regional and rural Australia we have the ability to take advantage of the capabilities that broadband can provide, because we have farmers who have sophisticated business models who need proper telecommunications to be able to deliver for their businesses. We have businesses within our towns who can do that. Mr Deputy Speaker, we are delivering and we will continue.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I've news for the member for Wannon. He's going to be extremely disappointed when the NBN starts rolling out in his electorate. Mr Deputy Speaker, the rollout of Malcolm Turnbull's fibre to the node NBN in Shortland electorate has been an abject failure, and the contribution by the member for Wannon shows that he just really doesn't understand what's happening. Now, the people of Shortland electorate waited with great anticipation and expectation for the NBN to be rolled out in our area. There was great excitement in the community, and many of my constituents rushed off very quickly to connect to the NBN. But they have been devastated because there has been a tyranny of disasters. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, I hate to say this, but my office, my electorate office, has become an NBN complaints office, and I will share some of those complaints with the House this afternoon. Now, there's been a tyranny of disasters, as I mentioned. Services being disconnected, failure to reconnect them, no service whatsoever for my constituents, poor communication between NBN and the providers. And I might say it's not just one provider. It doesn't matter which provider it is, there's a problem. Telstra, Optus, Westnet, Dodo, TPG, all the constituents in Shortland electorate are having problems with their provider and NBN, because it's not a provider problem, it's an NBN problem. Be really aware of it. It's not a provider problem, it's an NBN problem. It's not one provider, it's all providers, because the NBN is not delivering. Now I'll just share my first example with you. And this is Jess. She has had 5 appointments rescheduled just to connect to the NBN. That's the technician. And when the technician came today, he said, "You've got no connection, no phone line connection." He came back, had another look, and he finally found it. And at 12 o'clock today, she finally was connected to the NBN, and that's taken since the 5th of January to connect. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, this has been a disaster. The cost blowout's been highlighted, failure to deliver the NBN, the service, the speed, and, of course, the broken promises that Prime Minister Turnbull made to the Australian people. The one thing that people in Shortland electorate have learnt is that you can't trust the Turnbull government. The Turnbull government's absolutely no different to the Abbott government, and they have failed the people of Shortland and the people, I'm sure, throughout Australia when it comes to the NBN. Now, I promised I'd share a few examples with you. Bruce and Rita, they had problems with their NBN and Optus. They had no service. They've had no service since the 1st of February. They can't receive phone calls, they can't dial out, and they're having enormous problems. And of course there's Jerry from Valentine, who works from home. He's a director. He is getting he switched from ADSL 2, and he was receiving 13 MBS a second. Now, just listen to this. Now he's receiving as little as 4 and 5. It is an absolute disgrace, and it is a broken promise to the people of Australia. Why should a director like Jerry have his business put in jeopardy because this government fails to deliver what it promised? And then there's Philip, he says, I'm no tech guru, but on the 12th of January he signed up with ISP Westnest. 4 days, took 4 days to get the internet working, still without a landline, and that was this month. And this goes on and on and on. This government promised the people of Shortland electorate that they were going to get a fast broadband connection, but they have not received it. This government has tricked the people of Shortland. They're tricking the people of Australia. And I say to Karen and Deidre and Edward and Ian and Des and Maxwell Taylor, who the Shadow Minister spoke about, David, even Belmont Meals on Wheels, I'm sorry that this government is so inept at delivering what they promised. You deserve a decent fast-speed broadband. And Malcolm
expired. I thank the honourable member for Shortland, and I call the honourable member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I had hoped today, with the member for Blaxland coming in here in a nice conservative blue tie and me wearing red, that we might be on a reverse unity ticket, member for Blaxland. But only 5 seconds into his speech, we were disappointed, and so were the members of the gallery. I saw their faces drop when he started going into the negative diatribe that we so often hear. And if we just go back to the corporate plan for Labor in 2010, it claimed that the NBN would pass almost 1 million premises, and we know that they failed to get barely 100,000. Now that's less than the city of Geelong. That is even half the size of the city of Geelong. It was less than the city of Gosford. Now we are talking about major regional centres in Australia, and they performed poorly in not even reaching those expectations.
Off the NBN rollout.
Exactly, thank you, the member for Corangamite. And under the Labor, the NBN Co failed to meet every single target. And as the member for Blaxland leaves the chamber, he's going back to look at the business plan that they didn't even do. Now, it's fundamental in major government infrastructure policies to do a cost-benefit analysis, to do a business plan. Anyone with a business background, like my good colleagues around me here, they've been through that rigour and diligence and discipline in undertaking business plans. And I note the member for Hume, and I just reflect on one of the comments from the Labor speakers, opposition speakers. They said that stories are flooding in from the electorate offices about the poor performance of the NBN. Well, let's just have a look at one example with a member for Hume that he informed us of recently. The NBN fixed line to some 25 towns in his area. The NBN fixed wireless to some 35. Correct me if I'm roundabout figures, member for Hume. Those people in the member for Hume's electorate, especially on the eastern area, they are rejoicing. They have got NBN. They've got better broadband because of the way this federal government has implemented successfully the NBN, managed the company the way it should be managed, undertaken business plans and effective local members, whether it be the member for Hume, the member for Wannon, the member for Longland, the member for Corangamite, the member for Barton. They have each individually got results in their local electorates pushing the case for more effective broadband and NBN. Now, let's just revisit some other history recently in the project itself, and I just want to go back to some fundamentals of the complexity of this program. It's the largest and most complex infrastructure project ever embarked on, and our corporate plan is the most rigorous and detailed financial planning document. As the scientist, the politician, the writer Benjamin Franklin once said, "If you fail to plan, you are planning to fail." Now, how apt is that? I mean, I see the members in the gallery nodding their heads, acknowledging that the work of this government, yes, they have good NBN, they have given us the thumbs up, they knowing that this government is on the right track. That's why they come into this chamber, to hear facts, to hear success, to hear execution, to hear corporate governance, and to hear a successful government implementing a rigorous, detailed plan. That's why they come into this chamber and hear what the government is doing. And let's look at the satisfaction of broadband. And there's been surveys recently that have highlighted that the levels of satisfaction of broadband services using fibre to the node are the same as those using the gold-plated fibre to the premises. They're the same. What value for money we are delivering. And it wasn't so long ago that we had the former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, complain about the gold-plating of our electricity networks. And again, I see the members of the gallery shaking their heads with the gold-plating of the electricity networks, those utility bills that they're hating. But when they talk about the NBN, they are once again happy. Happy that they're getting NBN, happy that the broadband is improving, and happy that the coalition government is delivering. And let me finish with a good little story from the Murray cod farmer, Noel Penfold, who used to live in a broadband black spot. But since hooking up to the National Broadband Network, he has more than tripled his exports of his native fish to China. And he says, the internet was very poor before that in Wagga Wagga, but now it's improved and I'm exporting far more to China. Success of our story of NBN, success of our trade agreements, and success of this work of the government. And I look forward to the opposition coming forward with maybe a better business case and corporate plan than they did previously.
I thank the honourable member for Hindmarsh, and I call the honourable member for Canberra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's a great pleasure to speak on this MPI this afternoon because, Deputy Speaker, Canberrans are furious. They are furious about the fact that parts of my electorate, the southern parts of my electorate, aren't even on the rollout map, Deputy Speaker. They are furious about the fact that they're just one big blank, Deputy Speaker, when it comes to the NBN rollout. What does that mean, Deputy Speaker? Here we are, here in the nation's capital. What does that mean for the people of the nation's capital, who we know this government? Coalition governments have got form when it comes to the nation's capital. They've got form. In 1996, 15,000 jobs were cut here, and at this time, this round, the coalition government, we've lost 8,500. The coalition governments have got complete form when it comes to lack of investment in the nation's capital. Sir Robert Menzies would be turning in his grave. He respected this capital. He invested in this capital. He built this capital up. And what do coalitions do since then? They just tear it apart. 15,000 jobs lost in 1996, Deputy Speaker, 8,500 in this round of this coalition government. Now, Deputy Speaker, I've got comments here from people from my electorate. Here's a comment from Melanie. My family lived in Theodore for 7 years and we now live in Cornwall. My 3 children go to local schools, Cornwall High and Theodore Primary, and my husband runs a small business from a home office. I'm a public servant. I study part-time and I often work from home. Slow internet has a real impact on our day-to-day lives, our ability to contribute to the economy and our educations. We are a hard-working family and we make a genuine contribution through our taxes. Our lives are increasingly reliant on the internet, and 3 years is too long for us to have to wait to have this fixed. And this from Adrian. In global standards, we are a third-world country when it comes to internet download speeds and pricing. Latvia has faster average internet speeds than we damn do. And this from Matthew. It is hard to believe and embarrassing to admit that there is no high-speed broadband access for some people in the capital of the country. And this from another constituent. I stand with you in that Canberra is in dire need of attention on this matter. Although there is a relatively small population here, as such a hub of government and government contractor activity, the productivity that has been enhanced by the introduction of the internet is being bottlenecked by the poor standard of our network. Not to mention how embarrassing it is for us to have foreign representatives living here whose communication networks back home undoubtedly, like Latvia, are vastly better than our own. And of the lack of NBN, Vicky says, I'm trying to establish a new business and work from home. The lost earnings are immeasurable because she can't get access. She can't work from home. And I've heard, Deputy Speaker, from other constituents who want to work from home, who want to run their small businesses from home, but have to go to the expense and inconvenience of actually hiring an office because of the poor internet speeds here, Deputy Speaker. They can't actually have a home-based small business. But just back to Vicky. The lost earnings are immeasurable and the inconvenience unacceptable. Now, Deputy Speaker, these are some of the comments I've received from Canberrans on NBN this year. And just this year, it's only February, Deputy Speaker. You should see the dray load of comments I had last year, particularly after the Shadow Minister had an NBN community consultation with my community. It's crystal clear, Deputy Speaker, it's crystal clear that the Prime Minister is failing Canberrans when it comes to NBN. Now, when it comes to our wonderful city, there's a lot to boast about. We're the most highly educated population in the country. We've got the highest rate of volunteering in the country. We've got the highest average income in the country. We're the healthiest population in the country. But there's one aspect of our city that I will not boast about, Deputy Speaker, and that I'm in fact fairly ashamed of, and that is our internet connectivity. Despite being the national capital, despite being home to government, despite having defence and world-leading universities and scientific and cultural institutions here, embassies, under the Prime Minister's rollout map, large parts of Canberra aren't even visible. As I said before, aren't even visible. There ain't no plan. There ain't no plan for parts of my electorate. Huge swathes of my electorate. There ain't no rollout plan for the NBN. They're invisible. They are invisible to this government and NBN Co. They are not even on the map. And this is despite the fact that these suburbs in Canberra have the lowest rating in the country for both availability and quality of broadband. The lowest in the country, Deputy Speaker. We're talking the nation's capital here. It's breathtaking. It's appalling. It's absolutely outrageous. I call on the Turnbull government to prioritise Canberra on the NBN rollout map. I've written to the minister. I'd like a response, Minister, to my call for
the member's time has expired, and I call the honourable member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm really pleased to speak to this debate today because it clearly exposes the fact that the only second-rate NBN in Australia is the one that was going to be delivered by Labor, the party who, when in government, promised one thing but then delivered little more than press releases and promises that stretched into the never-never land for years, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's no exaggeration to say that under the previous Labor government, the NBN was one of the most poorly managed projects in the history of the Commonwealth. When they announced it with great fanfare, then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and Minister Conroy extravagantly promised that the rollout would be complete by 2018 and would cost the government no more than $26 billion. And of course, Labor representatives in my electorate on the Central Coast did the same. In April 2013, former Labor MP Deborah O'Neill and Minister Conroy came to Gosford and pushed a great big red button on the Gosford waterfront, claiming our region was open for business thanks to the NBN. In fact, the then member for Robertson said, "We love this town and we love where we live, but we need jobs and we needed something to transform this area. It's time to come to Gosford and do some business," she said. Well, it is time to come to Gosford and do business, and so it's pretty ironic, I have to say, see Senator O'Neill now actively campaigning against the Turnbull government's commitment to deliver 600 new federal jobs into Gosford. But I digress, Mr Deputy Speaker, because while Labor claimed their NBN was a magic bullet, when the gloss of the press release and the shiny red button wore off, it was a mess. It was a mess around Australia and it was a mess on the Central Coast. For instance, despite Labor's claims on the coast that a massive 90% of premises in and around Gosford, and you may wish to listen to this, members opposite, because this is your record, a massive 90% of premises in and around Gosford were so-called open for business for the NBN. In actual fact, 90% of them were classified as Service Class 0 or Service Class 1, meaning that despite the fanfare, despite the press release, a lot of work was required before those people who actually wanted a service could actually connect. What's even worse, despite all of this fanfare, during the election and during their time in government, when we came into government, Mr Deputy Speaker, there were a little more than 200 premises connected in my electorate. What a farce, Mr Deputy Speaker, to tell businesses and families that Gosford was open for business, only to discover that despite Labor's press releases, they couldn't actually access it at their premise. In fact, Labor was so obsessed with delivering fibre to the press release in Gosford, they forgot that the focus in unlocking superfast broadband is supposed to be about actually getting residents, businesses and families actually connected. Mr Deputy Speaker, Labor sold people in my electorate a dud deal. In contrast, this coalition government has spent more than 2 years cleaning up the mess in my electorate and around Australia. We've sought to clean up the mess home by home, piece by piece, the mess left to us by those opposite, while at the same time rolling out the NBN to more homes and businesses sooner, cheaper and much more reliably than Labor. This government has got a responsible strategy to roll out a more affordable multi-technology mix. The case for the multi-technology approach, Mr Deputy Speaker, is actually quite clear. It's far better for productivity on the Central Coast, for instance, to get fast broadband to premises quickly than to deliver extremely fast broadband to just an exclusive few years and years down the track. It's like waiting for Godot, Mr Deputy Speaker. But you can see the benefits of the Turnbull government's approach in the NBN's latest half-yearly results, as the member for Hindmarsh alluded to, because they reveal initial customer research that shows the level of satisfaction with broadband services delivered through fibre-to-the-node technology are the same as those using the gold-plated fibre-to-the-premise. Now, I grant you, Mr Deputy Speaker, our approach involves far less fanfare than members opposite, but the half-yearly results are a ringing endorsement of our approach. And in fact, the NBN rollout is accelerating, with 1.7 million homes and businesses now able to order a connection. We are finally back on track with the NBN rollout, with plans to expand the footprint by 15,000 premises per week, rising to 25,000 per week by middle of the year. And ultimately, of course, Mr Deputy Speaker, the goal is to connect 8 million premises by 2020 across all access technologies. But let me spend just the few remaining seconds I have, Mr Deputy Speaker, letting people know, letting members know, opposite know, the record that we have delivered to my electorate in just 2 short years. In my electorate, we now have more than 67,000 premises on the rollout schedule or already connected, and around half of these are only weeks away from being ready for service, not simply passed but ready for service in more than 20 suburbs like Woy Woy, Empire Bay, Pearl Beach, Saratoga.
And I call the honourable member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Incompetence, hopeless, useless, a joke. They are the words that people in Central Victoria and Regional Victoria use to describe this government's NBN plan. And you cannot get further than what has happened with the NBN towers to the north of the electorate. These towers were built in 2013 under the former Labor government, yet under this government, 2 and a bit years on, they have not been switched on. How incompetent are you as a government not to even switch these towers on? The towers of Gornal, the towers of Huntley North, the towers of Lake Epilogue, the towers in Ladies Pass. These towers have not been switched on. Businesses, look out their window to a tower that's not been switched on. Homes, look out their window to a tower that's not been switched on. Even more frustrating, we didn't get an answer as to why until 6 months ago, when NBN Co finally revealed that the relay tower that was Mount Camel to be built was not built, that it had been rejected by VCAT. Here we are 12 months since that rejection, and NBN Co and this government have refused to come up with an engineering solution. To this day, those 4 towers have not been switched on. To this day, there is no engineering solution to fix the relay tower to make sure that these people get access to the fixed wireless. That is how incompetent this government is when it comes to delivering the NBN to people in regional Victoria and in particular Central Victoria. Since this government got elected and they tore up the NBN plan for Central Victoria, not one extra home has been added to the availability of the broadband. The homes that have connected is because of contracts signed under the former Labor government. This government gets elected, rips up the plan, and Bendigo's rollout timetable is delayed. It's delayed by 2 years. We are knocked off the plan. It still has not happened. We've since been told we'll get fibre to the node. And this is why we have a black spot problem in regional Australia and in particular Central Victoria. Because people do not have access to fast-speed broadband in their homes, they are relying on their mobile phones to do their daily internet. That is clogging up the mobile phone network, and that is why we have black spot issues in the heart of Bendigo, or 5 kilometres from Bendigo, or in Woodend, or in Kyneton, or in Castlemaine. There is one street in Woodend where the service delivery of the internet, they've been offered 4 different types of services. There are some homes on ADSL 2, some homes on ADSL 1, some homes who've been told just use your internet on your phone, and some homes that have been told you'll have to get satellite services. That is one street in one town. In my electorate, 5. What a mess. 5 different options, including none at all, which is option number 5. These are areas that do rely on the internet for their businesses. These are areas that rely on the internet for online learning. These are areas where homes rely on the internet for programs. I have daily complaints from people in my electorate saying that they cannot get access to ADSL or to decent, reliable internet in their home. I've written to the minister. I've asked him to come to Central Victoria over and over again, the former minister and the current minister. But the former minister cancelled the meeting because he became the Prime Minister and said, sorry, the people of Central Victoria no longer matter to me. Yet during the election, he came to Bendigo and promised the people of Bendigo that they would get fast-speed broadband sooner and cheaper. What a con. It is an absolute con, and it is a lie, because here we are in 2016. He promised they'd get it in 2016, and people in Bendigo and Central Victoria still do not have it. He promised it would be cheaper, yet it has doubled. The cost has doubled. And not to mention that it is also slower, because the internet that he is promising, the fibre to the node that's been promised for Central Victoria, is relying on a copper network. How incompetent are you to buy back old ageing technology? Telstra think it's great. They've sold a dud asset back to a government. It is nothing but incompetence when it comes to the NBN, and people in Central Victoria know it, as does regional Victoria. Those coalition MPs can bury their head in the sand and pretend it's not an issue, but it is. And every single day there are people in their electorates like my electorate.
The member's time has expired, and I call the honourable member for Calare.
Thank you. I do appreciate, Deputy Speaker, and I obviously rise to talk about how the NBN is powering ahead in Calare. I heard not long ago the member for Wannon make the point that at the election his electorate wasn't on the radar till 2026. Well, he's fortunate because Calare wasn't even mentioned. We were not mentioned, Deputy Speaker. I just heard one of the opposition members talk about Australia and Australians, and I note they talk about Australians and the heading of their MPI. The people of Calare had every right to believe they were not Australian because they were not mentioned. Deputy Speaker, last year the comprehensive 3-year construction plan release was fantastic news for Calare, but as we were able to tell them very early on in this parliament, the whole priorities would change. When we got into government, it was those who needed it rather than the capital cities that were going to be highlighted and dealt with as early as possible. Deputy Speaker, the rollout will see 49,700 premises in Calare hooked up to the high-speed network. Under our government, a number of towns in our region will now be connected to the high-speed network much earlier than expected, even at the start of this rollout. The fixed line bill commenced in my hometown of Molong in December. In actual fact, I think when I went on to the fixed wireless on the fringe of Molong, I think I was the first federal member of parliament to go onto it, onto fixed line. The bill is now underway in Orange, and with it expected to be switched on progressively midway through this year. Deputy Speaker, a very high-speed data firm in Orange contacted me recently. They work around the world. They've recently put 24 people on. They're putting another 16 on. They asked me, I was able to contact the NBN and tell them they were actually going to be about 50 yards where the line will be hopefully ready in August for them, and they will be able to put their own line straight onto it. That will be their choice, and it will cost them something, but Telstra are going to charge them $110,000 a year to be on NBN broadband. This is a godsend to them. We The rollout will continue in Bathurst, Parkes, Blaney, Forbes and Oberon early next year, as well as in the Lithgow area. And we already have, Calare already has, in this short year or so, 40 fixed wireless towers operating successfully, including places like Mullen West, Oberon and Neville. Constituents Yvonne Ferner and Rita Cobb of Carcoar, Cobb with an E, moved from Wyatt Roy's electorate of Longman in Queensland to the sunny pastures of Calare at the start of 2014, despite assurances from the retail service provider that they would ADSL to connection at their new address. I was first forced to reply on a mostly unsatisfactory internet by the internet satellite, but Yvonne and Rita spent 18 fruitless months on what they described as a revolving walkabout until I found out that they were able to get onto the fixed wireless NBN. I can tell you within 3 weeks of that, they were connected to the wireless tower at Carcoar, and they are enjoying, in their words, 21st century internet. And in just a couple more months, the first of the 2 satellites, which will be able to handle between them 800,000 domiciles or contacts, and they will ensure people living in topographically challenging areas won't miss out and will receive extraordinarily good internet, chalk and cheese to the current system, which is satellite system, which is basically overloaded to blazes. And it will be so much better than what we have had up until now, particularly in my electorate, because obviously we can't put everybody on ground or even wireless. And funnily enough, it's not the remote far west where it's all going to be needed, although they obviously will have to use it as well. It's people along just on the western side of the Great Divide, places like Oberon, Lithgow and the like, where the topography is very bad. Thank heaven there are 2 satellites. The first one's gone up, an amazing story, Deputy Speaker, and that will look after those people. Jeff Peake from Peake Connect, whose family-owned company in Bathurst is thrilled to be a registered service provider for the NBN, said the NBN is a huge step forward and for country people, and the way it has been reprioritised has been very good for us.
The member's time has expired. The discussion is concluded.
Yes. I'd like to wish the member for Calare happy birthday for tomorrow.
I thank the honourable member for Hunter.